In early 1945, Europe was witnessing the final moments of the most violent conflict humanity had ever known. The Allied and Soviet armies stood on the borders of the German Reich, from the east and west like a giant pincer about to crush the heart of Nazi Germany. But before the Anglo-American forces stood a massive natural obstacle, a great water barrier that formed the Germans' final line of defense, the Rhine River. The Rhine River was not merely an ordinary waterway. It had been a symbol of German strength throughout history, and it was the last great natural obstacle facing the British, Canadian, and American armies before they could break into the heart of Germany. Although the Wehrmacht had been severely weakened, and although the Luftwaffe had become only a pale shadow of what it once was in its glory days, the mission was by no means easy. The Nazi leadership promised fierce resistance. Hitler and his commanders insisted on defending to the last man, to the last bullet. But the Allies were planning an overwhelming assault, a force the world had never seen before at this stage of the war. They were preparing for the largest airborne assault conducted in a single day during the entire Second World War. But let us understand the situation more deeply. In February 1945, the Western Allies were suffering from enormous logistical difficulties. Imagine supply lines stretching for hundreds of kilometers between their bases in England and the front lines in Holland and Germany. The problem was even more complicated because most continental ports were in a state of total ruin due to continuous bombardment throughout the years of war. The troops, especially the infantry, were completely exhausted after a difficult series of battles during the autumn and winter. The British and Canadians were still recovering from a severe shortage of reserve forces in late 1944. This meant that despite their superiority in numbers, heavy weapons, and near total control of the skies, the Allies did not feel they had enough resources to launch a major offensive along the entire front. After difficult and sometimes bitter negotiations between the commanders, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, decided that the main effort to break into Germany would be carried out by General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the northern Rhine region, where the terrain was flat and ideal for mobile warfare across the North German plain. The American generals Bradley and Patton were extremely angry about this decision, but the priority at that moment was elsewhere. And now, before we continue this deep narration, share in the comments and tell us where you are watching from which country, from which city, because your interaction does not only help the channel, but also lets us know for whom we create this content. The 21st Army Group launched its offensive to reach the Rhine River on the 8th of February, 1945. This massive military group included the British Second Army and the 1st Canadian Army, which in reality was mostly British, in addition to the American 9th Army. The planned breakthrough to seize an intact bridge in the city of Wesel never materialized. The 1st Canadian Army spent weeks of exhausting and difficult fighting to slowly push the German army backward. It was a true war of attrition. Every meter of ground cost precious blood. When the floodwaters receded, the American 9th Army joined them. Together, they forced the Germans to retreat across the river by the 10th of March. But the Germans managed to withdraw and blow up the last bridges behind them, turning the Rhine River into a gigantic moat separating them from their enemies. Field Marshal Montgomery decided to wait until the detailed preparations were completed before attempting to cross the river. Monty's style of command depended on meticulous planning before any attack. This was partly because the British and Canadians under his command could not afford heavy casualties. He faced severe criticism from contemporaries and historians alike. for being overly cautious and slow, and for failing to fully exploit opportunities when they appeared. Some suggest that he wanted to avoid another failure, like the one that occurred during Operation Market Garden at Arnhem in the autumn of 1944. That disaster still lingered in his mind and in the minds of his men. The commander of the American Ninth Army, Bill Simpson, wanted to maintain the momentum and cross the Rhine River, while the Germans were still trying to recover from their defeats west of the river. But Monty said no decisively. Meanwhile, south of the 21st Army Group, the American generals who resented being forced to accept restrictions on their offensive movements seized the initiative. On the 7th of March, forces of the American First Army surprised the Germans defending the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine River at Remagen and captured it intact and operational. It was a stunning strategic victory that changed all calculations. On the 2nd of March, General George Patton began moving his men across the river at Oppenheim and felt great satisfaction because he had outpaced his rival Monty in the race. These American units had already crossed the Rhine River, but the rugged terrain on the eastern bank and the German reinforcements arriving from the north limited their progress for the time being. Montgomery's plan for the main crossing had two parts. On the 23rd of March, Operation Plunder would see the ground forces cross after a massive artillery bombardment. Then, on the morning of the 24th, Operation Varsity would drop 16,000 paratroopers and glider infantry, the largest airborne landing in a single day during the entire war. The paratroopers would secure the area directly in front of the ground forces crossing the river. Once the two linked up, the Allies could surge across the flatlands into the industrial Ruhr region and beyond, perhaps even to Berlin itself. In Montgomery's own words, the intention was to cross the Rhine north of the Ruhr and secure a strong bridgehead with the objective of developing operations to isolate the Ruhr and penetrate deeper into Germany. In total, 1,002,000 Allied soldiers and 5,000 artillery guns would participate in the crossing and the breakthrough into the North German plain. The German 1st Parachute Army, which defended the Northern Rhine, had been reduced to merely 85,000 men, 1,000 artillery pieces, and fewer than 120 tanks. The disparity in strength was enormous and terrifying. As the armies prepared for battle in the village of Hammenkeln, on the eastern bank of the Rhine, an 83-year-old woman named Sophie Becker confided her fears in her diary. She wrote with a trembling hand, "We have not been defeated. Germany still has the Rhine, and it has always protected us. I pray to God to protect us now in our hour of need. Perhaps the Americans will fail." The words of Sophie Becker reflected the feelings of many ordinary Germans in those dark days. They believed that the Rhine River, this great natural barrier, would be their final fortress against invasion. But the bitter truth was that the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the ability to repel a force of this size. Operation Plunder began on the evening of the 23rd of March, 1945. Winston Churchill himself, General Eisenhower, and Field Marshal Alan Brooke all gathered on a nearby hill to personally witness the historic moment unfold. It was a historic event they did not want to miss. The Allied forces were understandably anxious, so one British officer found these words to reassure his men in a sarcastic manner. "If you happen to hear a few stray shots, there is no need to think they are aimed at you. That, gentlemen, would be a form of selfishness." It was an attempt to ease the tension with the dark humor for which British soldiers were famous. After the aerial bombardment, the British, Canadian, and American artillery unleashed a storm of fire upon the German positions for 4 full hours to destroy as many defensive positions as possible, so that the vulnerable infantry could cross in relative safety. The bombardment was so immense that the ground shook for miles around. German artillery officer Oberst von Lüttwitz-Ehrenberg jumped into action. He wrote in his memoirs, "We were sitting around a bottle of cognac, the only thing that could calm our nerves even slightly. Suddenly there was a crashing sound, and then all hell exploded. Without saying a word, we all knew the time had come." He added, "Incredibly heavy fire was falling upon the small town. Although we were forced to take cover because of the enemy's continuous fire, we began firing upon the opposite bank." This success earned even more enemy shells upon his positions, and soon the batteries reported their first casualties. The Highland Scottish Division crossed opposite the town of Rees, while the 5th Scottish Division crossed south of it, and the British 1st Commando Brigade landed directly north of Wesel, before turning south to capture the ruins of the bombed city. The 2 American divisions carried out their crossings at the southern end of the line between Wesel and Dinslaken. This initial wave was followed by a Canadian brigade that included an armored unit and more British and American infantry, and most importantly, armored vehicles. The tanks were the true key to success in this battle. Facing the Allied forces were 2 German infantry divisions and 2 paratrooper divisions, all severely exhausted, along with the remnants of the 15th and 16th Panzer divisions held in nearby reserve. Although the commander of the German Army Group, Johannes Blaskowitz, committed his tanks early, the Allied forces rapidly reinforced their bridgeheads. The Highland Scots captured Rees by the end of the 24th of March, but their commander, General Tom Rennie, was killed in battle. It was a devastating loss for the British command, but the men continued fighting bravely despite losing their beloved commander. After a dramatic crossing near the ruins of a destroyed railway bridge, which can still be seen today, the commandos secured the devastated ground at Wesel. The fighting in Wesel was bitter and fierce, and it claimed the life of the German general Alfred Deutsch. There are conflicting stories about the circumstances of Deutsch's death. One of them comes from a British commando named Philip Pritchard. Pritchard said, "In the middle of the battle, while passing through Wesel, we found a commando corporal digging a grave in a garden. This seemed strange, and we asked him why he was doing it." Pritchard continued his astonishing account. He said that his platoon had been searching a house when they encountered a German officer. The corporal immediately said, "Hands up," but the German replied, "I am General Deutsch, and I will surrender only to an officer of equal rank." The corporal, tired of all this, said, "Well, this will make you equal," and fired his submachine gun at the general with fatal results. Brigadier Mills Roberts was extremely angry, and as punishment, he ordered the corporal to bury the general himself. The 2 American divisions encountered very little serious resistance. This was partly due to the weakness of the Germans, but also because of the 1,000 shells per minute that the Americans fired at the German positions in the hour preceding the crossing. The Americans suffered only 30 casualties on the 24th, including the unfortunate men who died from hypothermia after their boat overturned and threw them into the freezing Rhine River. By the afternoon, the division was no longer facing organized resistance in its sector. The Germans were in complete disarray in this part of the front. The Rhine River defenses had first been breached by the Americans at Remagen, but now the Allies were across the river in full force. The engineers worked with intense urgency to build more and more bridges. Soon, Allied tanks, trucks, and artillery began rolling across the Rhine River to support the infantry and break through the remaining German defenses. It was a majestic sight, an endless column of military vehicles crossing the great river. By the end of the 24th of March, the Allied bridgehead was 40 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers deep. Operation Plunder was proceeding according to plan, and soon Allied armor, supplies, and infantry reinforcements were pouring across the river over newly constructed bridges. Directly ahead, the German forces already had their hands full with the largest airborne assault of any single day during the war. The paratroopers were about to completely change the course of the battle. The artillery bombardment preceding the crossing was so intense that it destroyed most of the German fortifications. The Germans who survived were in a state of shock, unable to effectively coordinate their defenses. This gave the Allied forces the golden opportunity they had been waiting for. Operation Varsity began on the 24th of March at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. A fleet of British and American aircraft roared over the Rhine River, carrying 16,000 British, American, and Canadian soldiers. There were 1,700 transport aircraft, 1,348 gliders, and an escort force consisting of 900 fighter aircraft to ensure that they reached their destination. The sight was both majestic and terrifying at the same time. The sky was filled with aircraft to such an extent that some witnesses said you could walk across the plains because of how densely they crowded the sky. But what the escort fighters provided little protection against was the German anti-aircraft fire. The German anti-aircraft guns fired shells into the air with terrifying intensity, and the relatively slow-moving transport planes and gliders suffered extremely heavy losses in the sky. Things seemed far worse for the men inside the defenseless aircraft, such as the American soldier Jack Areola. Areola said in his memoirs, "The anti-aircraft fire was so dense that I thought we could step out and walk on it. Bullets and shrapnel were piercing the glider, and every time one struck the bottom of the glider and exited through the top, the sound was like thunder, only 10 times louder. It was terribly damaging to morale." German Lieutenant Otto Leitner was commanding a 20mm anti-aircraft battery below. Leitner coldly stated, "With so many aircraft, it was difficult not to hit something. I ordered my men to keep firing in the hope that by filling the sky with metal, some of it would cause damage." The men of the British 6th Airborne Division and the American 17th Airborne Division were dropped or glided onto 10 landing zones in order to seize the high ground along the Issel River before linking up with the ground forces advancing from the river. Many of the gliders crashed upon landing, causing further casualties before the men could fire a single shot. One of them was the commander of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, whose body was later found hanging from a tree. A major took command in his place, and the Canadians continued fighting without knowing Nicklin's fate. It was a tragic moment, but the professional soldiers continued their mission. Some units, such as the American 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, near the Deersfort Forest, landed in the wrong place and first had to orient themselves before they could move toward their objectives. Amid the chaos, smoke, and fire, finding direction was extremely difficult. The fighting around the village of Hammenkeln and the nearby Deersfort Forest was intense and violent. But once the Allied forces managed to organize themselves, they overcame the German defenders, who were fewer in number. They did not possess much heavy weaponry like regular ground forces, but the gliders brought all kinds of heavier equipment. The gliders brought jeeps, trucks, bulldozers, universal carriers, mortar shells, anti-tank guns, and even light M22 Locust tanks. Hammenkeln soon fell into British hands, but the Oxford and Bucks Regiment encountered problems while trying to hold a bridge over the Issel River. General Blaskowitz sent the 16th Panzer Division from reserve, but it was a division in name only. Nevertheless, the few tanks the Germans still possessed caused problems for the more lightly armed British troops. They were forced to abandon the bridge and blow it up to prevent further German advances. The Canadians also faced a difficult battle. Corporal Medic Frederick Topham watched other medics being killed while attempting to treat a wounded man lying exposed in the open. Topham ran forward and began treating the casualty when he himself was shot in the nose. The pain was severe and the bleeding heavy, but he did not stop his mission. Despite the heavy bleeding and excruciating pain, he never hesitated in carrying out his duty. After finishing the first aid, he slowly and steadily carried the wounded man through continuous fire to the shelter of the forest. During the next 2 hours, Topham worked tirelessly to bring in the wounded, showing complete disregard for the enemy's heavy and accurate fire. On his way back to his company, he came across a carrier vehicle that had received a direct hit. Enemy mortar shells were still falling around it, and the carrier itself was burning fiercely, while its mortar ammunition exploded. Although one of the men died almost immediately afterward, he arranged the evacuation of the other 2 men, who undoubtedly owed their lives to him. But Topham was not the only Allied soldier who won his country's highest decoration that day. 2 American soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions during Operation Varsity. The courage of these men was extraordinary on a day when everyone was fighting bravely. In the days following the landing, the Allies pushed eastward with force. The British and American forces linked up with the paratroopers on the 25th of March, the same day that Winston Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine River himself, despite the fact that it was still within range of German artillery, which dropped a few shells in the area. While Churchill's visit was being recorded for newsreels around the world, a German artillery observer in nearby Emmerich made a brief note in his diary. He wrote in a tone of exhaustion and resignation, "From yesterday evening until this morning, once again, heavy barrages in our area, artillery attacks as well, fighter-bomber activity particularly intense, and aerial observation." Then he unexpectedly added, in a poetic manner unusual for a soldier in the midst of battle, "Unaffected by mankind's futile efforts, nature granted this Sunday glorious spring sunshine." It was a surreal moment of beauty amid total destruction. Operations Plunder and Varsity achieved their objectives in securing a major crossing of the Rhine River for the Allies, but they became the subject of controversy. Some historians and military leaders criticized Varsity as being extremely costly and argued that the same objectives could have been achieved by the ground forces advancing from the river with fewer losses against the weakened Germans. The airborne assault took place in broad daylight, and many American pilots had never before towed gliders. The new C-46 transport aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, which caused them to catch fire more easily when hit. These were tactical mistakes that could have been avoided. Others, including General Eisenhower, defended Varsity, pointing out that the forces had been successful, the landings more accurate than previous airborne operations, and the German artillery and rear positions had been eliminated more quickly. There were strong arguments on both sides. In any case, by the 28th of March, German resistance on the eastern bank of the river, facing the 21st Army Group, had been reduced to isolated pockets only. Allied soldiers liberated the infamous forced labor camp at Rees and found horrifying scenes of human suffering. In the south, the Americans expanded their other bridgeheads, and the remnants of the once powerful Wehrmacht were in full retreat along the entire Western Front. The Rhine River had been crossed, and Allied armor was racing to encircle the Ruhr and strike into central Germany. But from this point onward, the main Allied effort would be carried out by the American armies pushing into central Germany. The British and Canadians, despite their success in crossing the Rhine, would not be the principal armies in the final push toward Berlin. This was as much a political decision as it was a military one. Churchill remarked during dinner, "The German is beaten." These were fitting words from a man who had seen his country endure 6 years of devastating war. The fighting would continue for another painful and bloody month, but the final decisive battle of the Second World War in the West had ended. The Wehrmacht, which had once been a terrifying military machine that occupied most of Europe, had now become a pale shadow of itself. The German soldiers, many of them merely boys or elderly men, were exhausted, demoralized, and abandoning the fight for a lost cause. Many German units surrendered without major resistance. They saw the writing on the wall and knew the war had been lost. Some continued fighting fiercely, either out of loyalty to the Nazi regime or fear of punishment from the German leadership for deserters. But most were simply searching for an opportunity to surrender. By the end of March, the American forces had broken deep into German territory. The 3rd Armored Division under General Patton was moving with astonishing speed, at times advancing dozens of kilometers in a single day. This was the type of fast-moving warfare at which Patton excelled. In the north, the British and Canadian forces were also advancing, though at a more cautious pace. Montgomery remained careful not to risk heavy casualties when the war was clearly approaching its end. His men were exhausted, and they had been fighting since 1939. The road to Berlin was now open, at least from a military standpoint. But the political decisions made at the Yalta and Tehran conferences meant that Soviet forces, not the Anglo-American armies, would be the ones to capture the German capital. This was a major source of frustration for many Western commanders. In the following weeks, Allied forces continued advancing through Germany, liberating concentration camps and discovering the full scale of the Nazi regime's atrocities. What they found in places such as Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. By early April, the Ruhr region, the heart of German industry, had been completely encircled. More than 300,000 German soldiers were trapped in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. This was the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front. The German commander of the trapped army group, Field Marshal Walter Model, initially refused to surrender, but when the situation became hopeless, he committed suicide in a forest near Duisburg rather than face captivity. He was one of the last true believers in the Nazi regime. The crossing of the Rhine was not merely a military achievement, but an enormous psychological turning point in the war. For the German people, the Rhine River was the final barrier, the defensive line that could not be crossed. When the Allies crossed it with relative ease, the last hopes of German victory vanished. The Rhine was more than just a river. It was a deep German national symbol, a natural barrier that had protected Germany from foreign invasions for centuries. The Nazi leadership attempted to maintain the morale of the people through propaganda about wonder weapons that would reverse the course of the war. They spoke of the new V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, and other secret weapons that would save the Reich. But few believed these promises any longer. The reality on the ground had become clearer than any propaganda. The Allied armies were advancing relentlessly, and the Wehrmacht was collapsing. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, worked day and night spreading false messages of hope through radio broadcasts and newspapers. He wrote fiery articles about the final sacrifice and the coming victory, but his words fell on deaf ears. The German people saw the destruction and defeat with their own eyes, and propaganda could no longer conceal the bitter reality. For the Allies, the crossing of the Rhine confirmed that the war in Europe was approaching its end. The soldiers who had endured years of brutal fighting began allowing themselves to hope that they might survive the war and return home. That hope had come at a terrible price. After long years of fear, death, and separation from loved ones, the soldiers' letters to their families during that period were filled with cautious optimism. One British soldier wrote to his wife, "Perhaps I will be home by summer. Perhaps we can finally live the life we dreamed of." They were simple words, but they carried the depth of suffering and hope experienced by millions of soldiers. From a logistical standpoint, the crossing of the Rhine opened the way for supplies and reinforcements to flow freely into the heart of Germany. The bridges built by military engineers allowed thousands of trucks and tanks to pass daily. This constant flow of supplies was crucial for maintaining the momentum of the advance. Without these bridges, it would have been impossible to keep the advancing armies supplied with fuel, ammunition, and food. The military engineers worked under extremely difficult conditions, often under enemy fire, to build these bridges. They used advanced techniques to construct floating bridges capable of supporting the weight of heavy tanks. Some of these bridges were so massive that they took only a few hours to build, an astonishing engineering achievement in wartime. German industry, already under immense pressure from the strategic bombing campaign, suffered a fatal blow with the loss of the Ruhr region. Without the coal and steel from the Ruhr, Germany could no longer produce the weapons and ammunition necessary to continue the war effectively. The Ruhr was the heart of German military industry, and its loss meant the loss of the ability to replenish fighting forces. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, later wrote in his memoirs that the loss of the Ruhr was the moment he realized the war had been irretrievably lost. Without the industrial production of the Ruhr, there was no hope of equipping the army or replacing the enormous equipment losses. Politically, the crossing of the Rhine proved to the world that Allied victory was inevitable. neutral country that had still been trading with Germany, began cutting their ties. Switzerland, which had maintained its neutrality throughout the war, began freezing German assets. Sweden halted its exports of vital iron ore to Germany. These were clear signs that the entire world could see the writing on the wall. Resistance movements in the occupied countries grew encouraged and intensified their attacks against the German occupation. In France, the French resistance increased its operations against retreating German forces. In the Netherlands and Belgium, resistance movements began seizing government buildings in anticipation of the arrival of liberation forces. For the ordinary German people, the crossing of the Rhine marked the beginning of the end. Many who still believed in the possibility of negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies now realized that unconditional surrender was the only possible outcome. There was no longer any room for bargaining or negotiation. The Allies had been clear in their demands. Civilians in German cities began preparing for occupation. Some hid valuables and stockpiled food, while others attempted to remove any evidence of affiliation with the Nazi Party. Many German women tore up and burned their husbands' Nazi Party membership cards out of fear of retaliation. Men hid their military uniforms and replaced them with civilian clothing. There was widespread fear about what the victorious soldiers might do, especially after years of Goebbels' propaganda about alleged Allied atrocities. Women in particular were afraid, as rumors of sexual violence by Soviet forces in the East had reached the West, though they were often exaggerated. In reality, the conduct of the Western Allied forces was generally disciplined, especially in comparison to the conduct of German forces in occupied territories. There were incidents of theft and violence, but they were exceptions rather than the rule. Military leadership enforced strict discipline on their troops, and severe punishments existed for violations of the laws of war. General Eisenhower issued strict orders to his forces to treat German civilians humanely. Despite everything Nazi Germany had done, he understood that building a lasting peace would require avoiding the creation of more hatred and desires for revenge. The psychological impact on the German army was profound. Many units that had fought bravely for years had now lost their will to fight. Desertion rates rose dramatically despite threats of execution from the Nazi military police and SS forces. German soldiers saw that the fighting no longer had meaning and that dying for a lost cause was foolishness. After the crossing of the Rhine, the pace of the German collapse accelerated dramatically. In the weeks following the end of March, almost the entire Western Front collapsed. American forces were at times advancing at speeds of 50 or 60 miles in a single day. There was no longer any organized defensive line, only scattered pockets of resistance here and there. The American 7th Army crossed the Rhine in early April and headed south toward Bavaria and Austria. The goal was to prevent the Nazis from establishing the so-called Alpine Fortress, a mythical stronghold in the Alps, from which the Germans were supposedly going to continue fighting even after the fall of Berlin. American intelligence feared that fanatical Nazis might turn the region into an impregnable fortress that would require years to subdue. In reality, the Alpine Fortress was largely a fantasy created by Goebbels' propaganda, but the Allies took it seriously at the time. They did not want to risk years of guerrilla warfare in the difficult mountainous terrain. The mountainous terrain in Bavaria and Austria was ideal for defense and could have cost thousands of lives to clear had there been serious resistance. Patton's Third Army swept through central Germany heading toward Czechoslovakia. Patton wanted to reach Prague before the Soviets and was convinced that the United States should occupy as much of Central Europe as possible before the arrival of the Red Army. He held deep suspicions about the intentions of the Soviet Union after the war and wanted America to be in the strongest possible negotiating position. But Eisenhower ordered him to stop at a line previously agreed upon with the Soviet Union. Patton was furious and told his aides that this was a grave strategic mistake that the West would regret. But he obeyed the orders reluctantly, understanding that political decisions were above his military rank. History would later prove that Patton had some justification for his concerns about the Soviet Union. The American First Army, which had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, moved eastward toward the Elbe River, where it was expected to meet Soviet forces advancing from the east. This long-awaited meeting between the Eastern and Western Allies would symbolize the end of Germany trapped between two fronts. It was a powerful symbol of the Grand Alliance's victory over Nazism. In April 1945, American and Soviet forces met for the first time on the Elbe River near the city of Torgau. It was a historic meeting immortalized in famous photographs of soldiers from both armies shaking hands and celebrating together. American and Soviet soldiers exchanged gifts and alcohol and tried to communicate despite the language barrier. It was a rare moment of unity before the Cold War began. But even in those celebratory moments, some military and political leaders could already see the beginning of the coming conflict. The mutual suspicions between East and West already existed, though hidden behind smiles and handshakes. While American and British forces advanced from the west, the Soviet Red Army launched its final assault on Berlin from the east. The battle for Berlin was one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the entire war, with fighting from house to house and street to street. The Soviet forces were determined to avenge all the suffering that Nazi Germany had inflicted upon their country. The battle for Berlin cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. The Soviets paid a terrible price for every street and every building, but they were determined to raise the red flag above the Reichstag building. For them, it was a symbolic victory after 4 years of brutal war on the Eastern Front. Hitler, trapped in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, refused to face reality until the very end. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed and expected counterattacks from units that had already been destroyed or had surrendered. It was a complete detachment from reality, a psychologically broken man living in a world of illusions. The generals around him knew the truth, but they were afraid to tell him. Some, such as General Jodl and Field Marshal Keitel, continued displaying loyalty until the end. Others, such as General Heinrici, tried to save what could still be saved of the troops and civilians, ignoring Hitler's suicidal orders. In April, as Soviet forces approached his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide together with his companion Eva Braun, whom he had married only hours before their deaths. His aides burned their bodies in the courtyard of the Chancellery in a desperate attempt to prevent the Soviets from finding the corpses. Even in death, Hitler feared being treated like Mussolini, whose body had been hung upside down in Milan. After Hitler, Admiral Karl Dönitz became head of state, but Dönitz knew that the game was over. He had no illusions about the possibility of continuing the war. His only mission was to negotiate an orderly surrender that would preserve what could still be preserved, especially attempting to save as many German troops and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. In May 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the document of Germany's unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The ceremony was brief and devoid of celebration, reflecting the mixed emotions of that moment. It was a victory for the Allies, but it was also a tragic ending for a country completely destroyed by Nazism. The Soviets insisted on a second surrender ceremony in Berlin. On the 8th of May, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the documents before Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. It was a more theatrical ceremony, with Zhukov seated at a raised table while the Germans stood before him as the defeated. The war in Europe officially ended on the 8th of May, 1945, the day that became known as Victory in Europe Day. Cities throughout Europe and America celebrated the end of the war. In London, hundreds of thousands poured into the streets in celebration. People gathered in Trafalgar Square, dancing, singing, and crying with joy and relief. Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, together with the royal family, to greet the crowds who hailed him as a national hero. In Paris, which had been liberated months earlier, the celebrations were joy mixed with sorrow over the years of occupation and suffering. The French celebrated on the Champs-Élysées, but many also remembered the thousands who had died at the resistance or had been sent to concentration camps and never returned. But the joy was not complete. The war against Japan was still continuing in the Pacific and would not end until August, after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in Europe itself, the scale of destruction and suffering was enormous. Millions were dead, entire cities destroyed, and economies completely collapsed. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 remains one of the most impressive military operations of the Second World War. It was not the largest or the bloodiest, but it represented the end of organized German resistance in the West. After the Rhine, there was no other natural defensive line the Germans could cling to. It was the moment when it became clear to everyone on the front that the war had been decided. The planning and logistical execution of the operation were remarkable. The assembly of more than 1 million men, thousands of guns and tanks, and a massive fleet of aircraft, and coordinating all of it in a synchronized assault, was an extraordinary organizational achievement. It demonstrated the extent of Allied superiority in resources and organization over exhausted Germany. It was a lesson in industrial power and logistical superiority, the ability to move all these troops and equipment, supply them with ammunition, fuel, and food, and maintain the momentum of the attack, was a testament to the immense industrial superiority of the Western Allies. America and Britain proved that they could wage war on a global scale while maintaining supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers. Operation Varsity, the largest airborne assault carried out in a single day during the war, remained a subject of debate among military historians. Was it necessary? Were the losses justified? The answers differ, but the reality is that the operation achieved its objectives and helped secure the bridgehead more quickly than would otherwise have been possible. The paratroopers captured their objectives in record time, allowing the ground forces to advance more rapidly and with fewer casualties. Critics point out that the airborne losses were unacceptably high and that the ground forces might have achieved the same results without the airborne assault. Defenders argue that the paratroopers prevented the Germans from organizing an effective counter-defense, and that the speed of the advance after the crossing saved more lives than the airborne operation cost. The lessons learned from the Rhine crossing operation influenced military thinking for decades to come. The importance of air superiority, the necessity of coordination between different branches of the military, and the critical value of strong logistical support were all lessons applied in later conflicts. Modern armies today still study the Rhine crossing as an example of meticulous planning and coordinated execution. Air power proved to be decisive, not only in strategic bombing but also in direct tactical support for ground forces. The fighter aircraft and medium bombers that attacked German positions before and during the crossing were essential to the success of the operation. For the British and Canadians, the battle was one of the final major military achievements of the war. After years of fighting from El Alamein to Normandy, they were now on German soil itself. But it was also a bitter reminder of the cost of war. Britain had paid a heavy price in lives and resources. The British Empire emerged from the war victorious but exhausted and drained. Britain lost its status as a global superpower after the war, partly because of the enormous cost of the conflict. Accumulated debt, human exhaustion, and the changing world order all contributed to the decline of British power in the decades that followed the war. For the Americans, the crossing of the Rhine confirmed their growing role as a global military power. The American armies, which had been relatively small at the beginning of the war, had now become the largest and strongest military force on the Western Front. This was the beginning of the American military dominance that would continue throughout the Cold War and beyond. America emerged from the war as the undisputed superpower of the Western world. The American economic and industrial power, untouched by war on its own soil, allowed the United States to supply not only its own armies, but also the armies of its allies. This economic superiority translated into enormous political influence in shaping the post-war world. For Germany, the crossing of the Rhine marked the absolute beginning of the end. The final weeks of the war brought enormous destruction to the country. Cities were destroyed by bombing, the economy collapsed completely, and millions of Germans were fleeing the fighting either westward from the Soviets or eastward from the Western Allies. It was a human tragedy by every measure, a tragedy brought upon its own people by the Nazi regime. Cities such as Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin became ruins. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the bombings, and millions more lost their homes. The mass migration of Germans from the Eastern territories, which became part of Poland and the Soviet Union after the war, was one of the largest forced population movements in history. The human legacy of the battle was complex. For the Allies, it was a necessary step toward defeating Nazism and liberating Europe. For German civilians, it was a catastrophe that brought the war to their doorsteps. Thousands of civilians were killed in the fighting or in the bombing that preceded it. The price of Nazism was devastating for the German people themselves. But the crossing of the Rhine also brought liberation to millions who had suffered under Nazi occupation. Forced laborers in German factories, prisoners of war in concentration camps, and Holocaust survivors all saw the advancing Allied forces as their saviors. For them, the crossing of the Rhine was the beginning of freedom and hope for a new life. When the Allies liberated the concentration camps, They discovered the full scale of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. The scenes the soldiers encountered in places such as Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald shocked them to their core. Many battle-hardened soldiers broke down in tears when they saw the emaciated survivors and the piles of corpses. Today, the sites that witnessed the crossing of the Rhine are quiet and peaceful. The villages that were destroyed have been rebuilt, and the fields that witnessed fierce fighting have once again become green farmland. But the memory remains in memorials and museums, and in the stories of survivors and their families. The military cemeteries spread throughout the region remind us of the terrible price paid for peace. The crossing of the Rhine River was more than just a military battle. It was a turning point in history, the moment when it became clear that the most destructive war in human history was approaching its end. It was the beginning of the end for Nazism and the end of a dark era in European history. But it was also the beginning of a new era, one in which the United States and the Soviet Union would dominate global politics. We hope you enjoyed this detailed historical journey through one of the most important battles of the Second World War. If you enjoyed the content, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you can receive all new uploads. And share with us in the comments, what historical battle would you like us to cover in future episodes? We always listen to your suggestions and try to provide content that interests you.